Ethics and privacy. Ethics is hard to define. We'll get to that in a second. And privacy, even more difficult to define. We know what it is, but we don't know how to apply it in every case. So here's an example of something that encompasses both. I'm showing you a picture here that is graphic and disturbing, but it is not something, and this is the point, it's not something that hasn't been published before in a book that I wrote, and I took it from the front page of a newspaper, a major metropolitan newspaper. And this is an example of an ethical situation. A situation involving questions of right and wrong and why you do something you wouldn't normally do. We normally don't publish photos like this, but there was a reason why the editors thought it was an exception that was okay at the time. And is it acceptable to violate the privacy of the family in a case like this? Here are the facts on this matter. It was a photo in the Providence Evening Bulletin. Now, normally, a Metro Daily would not run a photo like this, but here was the situation. In Providence, Rhode Island, there's a lot of old stock housing, and there have been many recent fires. Many people died because, or it was alleged because, they did not have working smoke detectors. Now, these houses, they're called triple-deckers. They're fire traps. They're kind of meant to burn. When they were built back in the 1880s, 1890s, people didn't know. They didn't really understand the dynamics of a fire, so they're very dangerous. But you can't tear them down. That's where people live. So the death was thought to be preventable. Now here was the justification that the newspaper editor, James Wyman, a legendary editor who guided that paper to a Pulitzer, here's what he said. He caught a lot of heat for this, but he said, the message that it signaled to the public was overridingly important, powerful, and worthy. The reality of a fast-moving fire, the risks to residents, police, and firemen, the reality of the fact that sometimes forgotten or ignored, the grim fact that fire kills. In other words, he was saying, normally we would not do this, but in this case it was justified. Okay, here we get to the very simplified version of ethics. This is ethics in a nutshell. You have three basic schools of ethics: non-consequentialism, consequentialism, in the middle, the golden mean. Okay, non-consequentialism means that motives are the important factor. The consequence, hence the word non-consequence. The consequence is not important because you cannot predict a consequence. Consequentialists say, no, it's the outcome that matters. It's the greatest good for the greatest number. Do what provides the greatest, and actually Bentham and Mill were noted consequentialists. They used the word happiness, but they meant the same thing. What provides the greatest happiness, the greatest good for the greatest number. In the middle, there was Aristotle. Aristotle had this idea about the golden mean. The mean means the average, and what he said was, use practical reasoning to find a point halfway between excess and deficiency. So, basically, ethics is all about exceptions. Normally, we wouldn't do something, but here we will. This is particularly true in the news business. We normally don't publish graphic images. Now, here we have images that were shocking, that were graphic, and they caused some controversy, but what was stated was that yes, it's a very important news event. People need to know this, okay? You see what I'm getting at? It's the consequences, the ends that justify the means. We're going to put a very disturbing photo on the front of our newspaper, and in this case, the one on the left is more disturbing than the one on the right, but there's a reason for it. So we're talking about breaking the rules. It's probably time to talk about where the rules come from. Rules come from many different places. A lot is tradition. We just don't do this. It's a family newspaper. We don't put something like that on the front page. That tradition, of course, carries over to the web. Let me put it this way. In a newspaper, there's often an ethical out. The out is, if you don't want to put something disturbing on the front page, you link to it at a later page, or you jump to it. You say continued on page 15. A website, we can physically link to it. Whether that's a cop-out or not, good question. I've faced that many times myself. Is there any real difference between linking to a graphic or disturbing image on someone else's site or just posting it on my site? The rules come from philosophy and academic treatises, such as the one by Warren and Brandeis, which in 1890 looked at the right to privacy. Memo and meeting. This means after the editorial staff has held a meeting, they send out a memo and say, in the future, let's not do this. And then formal codes. Most news organizations, it's hard to count them, but we're safe in saying most news organizations do have some sort of ethical code, or they subscribe to an ethical code that has been produced by someone else. They usually deal with conflict of interest. In other words, the conflict between you doing your job and getting some sort of compensation from someone else, accuracy and truth, constitutional privilege, protecting sources. Someone gives you information. How far do you go? How far are you obligated to go to keep that secret? And do you have the right to offer them that sort of protection? Are they using you? Are they trying to peddle false information? And therefore, they can stand behind this veil of anonymity. Ethics codes deal with recognizing and correcting error, keeping things in context, objectivity, not letting our views color the story, and respect, responsibility, and privacy. Okay, here's a case. Remember that chart. Flip back to it if you want to. That showed consequentialism on one side, non-consequentialism on the other, and the golden mean in particular. Here's an ethical dilemma. A popular high school student kills himself inside of a building that's part of a school complex. He's an outstanding athlete, seemingly had everything to live for. Now here is the rule. Okay, most news organizations don't divulge that the death of an essentially private person is a suicide. But we're going to take a consequentialist view, says one editor, because I think it's worth breaking the rules. So here is how this case plays out in terms of moral philosophy. Yes, it's a real case. I've taken some liberties with it just to make the explanations simpler, but yes, it's a real case. Here we go. Arguing from a non-consequentialism viewpoint. We do not follow the rules. We follow the rules for a good reason. People are entitled to their privacy, and there is no journalistic need for this. Why are we bringing any sort of further pain to the family? The consequentialist view. It is the outcome that matters. Do what provides the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, in this case, what was the editor arguing? The editor was arguing this. The editor that wanted to be a consequentialist argued this. I know a lot about teenage suicide. My brother committed suicide, and it often happens that the person contemplating suicide talks to someone, like a parent, and are dismissed because the parent or other authority figure, someone who could help, says, you have everything to live for. You're handsome, you have a lot of friends, and essentially they're blown off. And they may then go on to commit suicide. So the consequentialist editor is saying, let's break the rules in this case because we will provide a greater good. Okay? The golden mean, person in the middle might compromise well, might compromise badly, but would look for some other way to handle this, perhaps running the story in a couple weeks. Here's another example. The mayor of a small town is a hardliner on crime. He has made local drug enforcement a major issue. He has berated judges for handing down a light sentence. Okay, his son, the mayor's son, is arrested for a drug offense. A small amount of marijuana. This is something that would probably never make the paper, even in a very small town, but the consequentialist in you or the consequentialist in your newsroom says, wait a minute, we need to make an exception. We make an exception because we're trying to show that the mayor apparently can't handle his own family, or that we're trying to show that that these things happen regardless of enforcement. Okay? I'm going to conclude with this very classic case here, the athlete with AIDS. True case. You have it from an unimpeachable source that a prominent tennis player has AIDS. He will not confirm or deny the report, but claims he has a right to privacy. Now, in general, major news organizations don't run unconfirmed reports about the medical problems of people who are not major public figures or officials. Do you make an exception in this case? This, of course, was the story about Arthur Ashe. Arthur Ashe had AIDS. Now, remember, this was a few years ago. There was an important newsworthiness aspect to this story in that Arthur Ashe had contracted AIDS through a blood transfusion. It was newsworthy because at that time it was thought by many that AIDS was only a disease of the gay or of people who used needles, hypodermic needles, illicitly. So you can make an argument that we're going to make an exception to this general rule we have about people's medical information being private because it serves a greater good. In this case, informing people of dangers in the blood supply. There were other ethical arguments in this case too. One was, now wait a minute, Arthur Ashe makes millions of dollars based on his fame. He's a celebrity. How is it that he can suddenly retract and say, I want to be covered about the things I want to be covered on, but not this? Probably nothing, with the possible exception of medical information, is as difficult ethically as graphic photos. I began with a graphic photo, will conclude with something along the same lines. This was the Boston Marathon, explosion near the end of the Boston Marathon. Obviously, a very impactful picture, but very gory. Some papers ran the unedited version on the left, where you can clearly see the bone and the other damage done to the person's leg. Other papers photoshopped it out. Now the rules, we've got two conflicting rules here, but generally the rules say we don't alter news photos because it's news. We do alter them to make them more legible. If they're too dark, we make them light and so forth. But you know, we're always on shaky ground here. So in this case, we had some news organizations coming up with different ways to approach this. Some blurred it out, some photoshopped it out. Now, why would people object to that? Well, they would say, wait a minute, people should know how awful and impactful this event was. Why is it that we blur it out to try and make it better? Other people will say, counter-argument was, no, stick to the rules. We don't put this stuff in a family newspaper because it's going to disturb people. People in their hearts know that a bomb going off is going to cause carnage. Why is it then that we have to run such a graphic photo? Okay, so what's wrong with this picture? Here's where the best of intentions can get in the way. The picture on the left had some smoke added to it. Now, to give the photographer, who was fired incidentally after doing this, to give the photographer the benefit of the doubt, let's assume that he did this in order to make the photo look a little bit better. Now, maybe when he actually saw the scene, the smoke was much more visible to him, and he said, wait, I should alter this photo to make it appear more like reality. But in any event, he added an extra plume of smoke to it and made the smoke thicker. This caused an international incident because this was in Lebanon. It was the aftermath of a raid attack by Israel, and Israel was outraged. Israel said, wait a minute, this was a surgical precise attack. You are making it look much worse than it was. And Reuters agreed. Most people agreed. You don't alter news photos, and the photographer was fired. But you see, that's a good example of why it's important to know about what ethics are, what the ethics codes say, because most ethics codes clearly say do not manipulate for purposes other than legibility a photo, a news photo. The photographer got himself into trouble perhaps without knowing what he was doing. Was he really trying to discredit Israel to make it look worse than it was? Probably not. But did he? Well, probably yes. But it was a distortion that was based on lack of knowledge of what the ethics community demands. And that's why we teach ethics. We teach ethics not to persuade you to become better people. I suppose that's helpful, but I don't know how much it would work. It's not to preach at you. It is to make you aware of the strictures in which you operate so you don't accidentally, without knowing it, commit an ethical transgression. An ethical transgression can haunt you for the rest of your career or indeed end that career. So here's the bottom line. Consequentialist exceptions are accepted, tolerated, usually if it's the only way to get the story, impersonating someone, doing some spying that may not be illegal but may be unethical. And unethical, of course, is the concept of doing what's right. Okay? Some people call ethics what you do when no one's looking. So there may not be a law against something, there may not be a rule against it, but there is this concept of operating ethically. Sometimes there are rules. Sometimes there are things called ethics laws, which is kind of a combination of two words. Ethics is not law. But yes, while you have some guidance, it's not always explicit. So you need to maintain an ethical outlook. Heavy reliance on anonymous sources. We don't like anonymous sources generally in journalism because that gives people license to say things that they don't have to stand behind. It also, unfortunately, gives journalists who are unethical by nature, and there are some, the ability to make things up and attribute it to an anonymous source. So we're looking for something that has great public benefit. In general, we give lots of latitude for consequentialism. We're often looking for what you call the higher right. You know, when something is obviously wrong, it's not so much an ethical issue, it's just blatantly wrong. But what concerns us is the balance of, hey, this is right and this is right, this alternative is good, this alternative is good, but ethically, which is the higher right? A scholar named Rushworth Kidder, he looked at core values of honesty, responsibility, respect, fairness, and compassion. He was consumed with his desire to study ethics, and he came up with these dilemmas. And you might think about this. It was his idea that many ethical decisions are a balance seeking the higher right between truth and loyalty, between benefits to the individual and benefits to the community. Do we sacrifice an individual for the benefit of everyone else? Short-term results versus long-term results. Justice versus mercy. Okay? We want to tell a story even though it damages someone because we are interested in the overall justice. But how far do we go in hurting someone, hurting an individual, to get overall justice? There's a concept called virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is the concept about Aristotle, the golden mean. It's kind of the golden mean, but there's a little bit more to it. And it's this. We have to use a basic sense of decency and a reasonable base of knowledge to make our ethical decisions. We consider, by looking for that golden mean, and here's where virtue ethics goes beyond strictly golden mean. We consider the consequentialist and the non-consequentialist alternatives and why we chose them. Are we choosing to stick to the rules because it saves us from a difficult decision? We can hide behind policy, say that's the rule, that's the way we've always done it. That may not be a good ethical decision. And that's what's involved in virtue ethics, considering why we are taking a consequentialist or a non-consequentialist view. And realizing that there may be a price to be paid. The ethical decision is often the one that is least comfortable for us. And to conclude on that last point, we talked extensively about Edward R. Murrow. You saw the film. Good night and good luck. Things did not end well for Edward R. Murrow. He did what he believed was the ethical thing to do, and I guess it was. Most of us think that it was, to pursue McCarthy. But in the long run, he did it at the expense of his career. He alienated himself from William Paley, the head of CBS. His career went downhill after that. He became very depressed, very disturbed. So remember, when you're considering the ethical situation, when you're considering the best alternative, looking for the higher right, there often is that nagging problem that it may not be the most convenient, expedient, or beneficial avenue for you personally.